Welcome to Conversations from the Heart, honoring Andrew Cohen through our stories. My name is Daniela Bomater. I was a student of Andrew's for 17 years, and for the past 9 years, I had the privilege of living and working alongside him. This series is a tribute to his life, his teaching, and the evolutionary fire he sparked in so many of us. Through these intimate conversations, we remember not only the man, but the depths of transformation he catalyzed in our lives. May these stories keep his legacy alive, honoring the sacred thread that connects us and allowing his voice to continue resonating through ours. So welcome, Pete, to these Conversations from the Heart. I'm very
Thank you,
happy
Daniela. It's great to be here
that
with you.
you are doing this with me, and I'm very curious where we will go. Like this conversation, it's the 9th conversation now that I'm having, and they all unfold naturally, and that's cool. I really love how it all works. But where I always start is with one question: how did you meet Andrew, and what happened there? So if you want to start there, that would be excellent.
I'd love to start there because it's quite an extraordinary story. Okay, so I met Andrew in 1992, and I was 27 at the time, and I was at a point in my life where I'd basically already pretty much given up everything and dedicated myself one-pointedly to spiritual life.
Mm.
And I had spent my early 20s traveling and exploring, and I found myself on a Buddhist meditation retreat in a forest in Thailand. And that's where I had my first blowout awakening of non-separation, of non-duality. And I was always haunted by that. And that set me on a path of meditation and basically in the context of Buddhism. So I think a year prior to when I came across Andrew, I had given up my life. I'd been living in Spain, teaching English for a while. And all I knew that I wanted to do was go on retreat. And I felt that it seemed inevitable that I was going to eventually ordain as a monk.
Wow.
I'd never really been a worldly person, and it just seemed that was what was going to happen. And so I ended up doing more retreats and living in a Buddhist monastery in England, which was part of the Thai forest tradition, Theravadan Buddhism, uh, led by a teacher called Ajahn Chah, an American, not Ajahn, it came from a lineage of Ajahn Chah, and it was an American teacher called Ajahn Sumedho, who pioneered the Sangha in the UK. So that I'd done many retreats in that tradition, all of which have been very profound and very inspiring. And then I found myself living in the monastery during a winter where I was part of a lay support team for the monastics who were on a retreat. And it was during this time that I actually began to get profoundly disillusioned with the actual life as it was being lived in the monastery.
Oh.
And so one thing led to another, and I gradually began to realize, oh my God, I'm not going to become a monk, because the freedom and clarity and whatever depth that I'd experienced in the retreats, I didn't find that was really being lived in the monastic setting. And in fact, on the contrary, there was a lot of heaviness. And it seemed to me that people in the lay support team were actually having a more liberated and intimate and ecstatic time than the monastics on the retreat. So it was a real crisis for me, because suddenly I was like, well, what the heck am I going to do now? I'd given up everything. I had no worldly desires. Wasn't attracted to doing anything else. And one day I remember, I actually stood up in my room. It was after I'd been reading a book by Arena Tweedy, that spiritual classic. And I got to a point in the book where her gurus basically said to her, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yeah.
And I stood up in my room. I was like overtaken by just an incredible longing, and I just prayed out loud. I was like, "Okay, I'm here. You know, I'm not going to be a monk. What? Show me, Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing else that I want." And I was kind of overcome by this and came to my senses. And then the next day, I went into the monastery library, and I wasn't really interested in looking in the sections of the library where I'd been interested before. So I started looking in this miscellaneous section that had things like vegetarian cookery and tarot cards and chakras, and just flicking through. And then I came across Andrew's first book, My Master is Myself.
Oh, wow.
I pulled it out, and it gives me shivers even now remembering, because when I picked up the book and held it in my hand, there was something immediately electric that overcame me. And then I remembered that a guy who'd been staying in the monastery earlier on had actually mentioned Andrew to me. I think he'd met Andrew in the early days, and clearly this man had had a profound experience with him. So I took the book to my room and just devoured it. And as I was reading it, and as you know, that book is incredibly transmissive. You know, it's Andrew's diary of his whole process with Punja. I began to experience many of the same revelations that he was describing in this book, and to the point where I was completely overwhelmed, and just my whole sense of self just shattered. And I remember walking out into the meadow after reading this book. I just put it down, and I was I had a tacit recognition that I, as Pete, the historical personality Pete, had never actually existed. And there was just this complete ecstatic recognition of oneness,
Yeah.
of no separation and never having been any separation. But at the same time, I remember as I looked up into the sky, there was this incredible sense of what I would call a divine demand. And it almost felt like God, if you like, this overarching consciousness that I was realizing. Um, it, the sense of it was almost like as if he was pointing down to me with a big finger and saying,
Yeah.
you need,
It means you.
yeah, you need to die and
Yeah.
surrender to
Yeah.
me, in other words, your true self. So I was also literally overcome with terror, completely. It was both ecstatic and terrifying. And yeah, but I just knew, oh my God, I found my teacher. And I scribbled must have been quite a crazy ecstatic letter. There was just an address on the back of the book. So I wrote a letter to Andrew. I mean, I remember holding it at the post box. I remember holding it there, and I remember having this thought: are you crazy? What are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
dropped it in. I just dropped
Yeah.
it in. Let it go. And then sometime later, I received a letter back from Andrew, and he told me that he was going to be in London that summer. This occurred
Yeah.
in February, I think it was. And what was interesting about that, when I met him actually in the flesh, so there I was at the satsang. It was being held in Hampstead, some school in Hampstead, and I can tacitly remember the moment when Andrew walked into the room, and I had an immediate recognition that we'd already met. It was like nothing occurred, and I had a recognition, oh, we've already met. So and then he began to teach, and then right at the end of the teaching, he said, is there a guy over there, anywhere over there, who sent me a letter? And he pointed out there, and I said, yeah, it was me. And then there was, and then there was just an ecstatic recognition. But yes, what's interesting about that also is that there was something in my meeting with Andrew that immediately was beyond the personal.
Yeah.
anything personal at all. And I think that, defined my relationship with him in a way. And yeah, anyway, maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And two things struck me. One is I do think that this sense of a transpersonal relationship with Andrew is probably something that we all shared, or many of us shared. And that's also where Andrew's teaching was pointing to, and what he was trying to convey,
Mm.
and what was often misunderstood, that
Yeah.
it's not impersonal, that it's not without humanity, that it's actually transpersonal, and that it's just a meeting from a much deeper, profounder depth, and not something impersonal where we don't see each other. And I think that's something that got lost a little bit, like this insight that this was what Andrew was transmitting and was pointing to. It was both. The teaching was pointing to, and he was transmitting it. His whole transmission was that. And also what also struck me is when you say it pointed to you, that's another thing that I can really relate to, that I always felt like Andrew was, or his transmission, or the guru in him was always pointing to us, to me. It means you, and you have to live up to it. Not only surrender, but also live up to it. Yeah, it was always both, like the surrender, as you said, but then also what are you doing with it? What are you doing with what you see here?
Mm. Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, that was so beautiful. So, and then you joined him, you joined the Sangha, or how did it
Yes.
continue?
Well, what happened then was, so this was in summer of 92.
Yeah,
So this was the time, it was like the beginning of phase two, if you
yeah,
like, about teaching. So I remember he started to give talks for the first time in
yeah.
these teachings. And I remember him just emphasizing, in the context of the more impersonal dimension, he was emphasizing then that he wasn't so interested in having personal dialogues with people, because he'd been doing that for many years. And he also wasn't so interested in encouraging what we could call a devotional relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
I remember like a lot of people were leaving flowers by his table, and I don't know if he asked, but or maybe someone said, Andrew doesn't want this to continue.
Yeah,
So there was
yeah,
some kind of shift where I think he was trying to take everybody into a more transpersonal
yeah.
place, and not so focused on a one-on-one relationship with people. Um, so he taught in London, and then Amsterdam, and then Bern in Switzerland. So I just followed him, and
Yeah.
there were a small group of us who followed him on those trips, and yeah, it was just an ecstatic, wild.
How many of you were you at that time that followed him around?
There was a group of about six or seven of us who kind of connected in London, and then we kind of got together, and we were actually paired up, and we were hitchhiking across Europe,
Mm.
renting a place in Amsterdam, and we're just finding our way. Yeah, a number of people who were my contemporaries in the community, like Craig Hamilton, Susan, people who ended up working on the magazine.
Yeah, yeah.
There's quite a lot of people who met Andrew on that in that year that just dove in and were deeply committed right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, after I got back from that trip, it was very clear that I just wanted to join. So at that
Mm-hmm.
time, the Sangha, which was still in its relatively early days, was in Marin County.
Yeah.
I ended up going over there. And maybe just to preface that in terms of a shift in my own process. So I was, while I'd had this extraordinary awakening when I'd read his book, I was by disposition a very kind of quiet character, very contemplative, meditative, and kind of kept myself to myself. But while at the same time, while I was with Andrew, I was having a lot of profound insights and revelations, which I would write to him about. But something very significant happened. It was when I was in Holland, and he gave this teaching, which ended up being a cassette, back in the days when we had cassettes, and it was called Passion and Detachment. And I was actually reflecting today, it was an early expression of, you could say what evolved later into being and becoming. And obviously I've been very schooled in the more Buddhist orientation of detachment, non-attachment, meditative, somewhat inward turning, contemplative process. And in this talk, he was just talking about passion, and this was one of the things that attracted me to Andrew right from the beginning, and that came roaring out of that book, Masters Myself, is this utter abandon and passion. And he was saying in this teaching that you could only discover true detachment through taking enormous risks, which completely blew my mind. I mean, even now, I can't really, it doesn't compute. The mind can't grasp that, but it completely blew apart whatever frames of reference I was operating within in terms of spirituality. And I went to see him for a personal interview after that teaching. And I remember he said to me, yeah, there's so much happening for you, because I'd been writing to him. But he said, why are you so quiet? Why aren't you connecting with my people here? Because I was keeping myself separate. And he just pointed right at me and he said, this passion will only destroy you if you allow it, if you allow it to take over. And I came out of there, remember walking to a group of his students that were in a circle by the canal. And I remember I just connected with everybody, and it was kind of the beginning of me coming out of that sort of more sense of still holding on to my own sort of separateness to whatever degree, and just this ecstatic communion with everybody that was there. And from that moment it became clear, like, yeah, that was what I wanted, and there was no question that I was going to join the community.
Oh, that's beautiful. And what I hear from what you are saying is something that came out in other conversations, this sense of that when you allow it to happen, the sense of intersubjectivity in between the Sangha members was there from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. It was there right from the beginning. And also when I first went to California, so this was a time when Andrew had just started to want to introduce some structure into the experiment there, because I think there were a number of people who kind of jumped in the deep end and then found out that it was too much for them. So it was the beginning of what was called the novice program at the time. And those of us that were part of that, we all had to shave our heads, so I looked a bit like you're looking right now. We were all celibate. It was a very full-on commitment. And but I remember that all happened very rapidly, and there we were, quite a diverse spectrum of men and women who'd all leaped into this. And different, quite a spectrum of ages as well. But there was just this seamless and beautiful intimacy and communion between us all right from the beginning. And indeed with everyone. And so that was definitely just a characteristic of what was happening around Andrew. This sense of, like, he always liked to call it the revolution. As you know, didn't really like the word community, but it was always this sense of that we were being consumed by a spiritual fire. And that was the one phrase I often remember so much, was so and so is on fire,
exactly.
Or have they caught fire yet? Then there was some There was something about this transmission. And then that reminds me also, when I discovered Masters myself in the Buddhist library, the very next day, the first edition of the What is Enlightenment journal, as it was at the time, and then it evolved into the magazine, also arrived in the library. And it was right on the front cover of it, it was a dialogue about this distinction that Andrew was just beginning to make between personal and impersonal enlightenment. And he said, the questioner asked, what's the difference between them? And he said, it's the difference between a burning match and a raging forest fire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, that captures exactly the spirit of what
and how aware, when you look back, how aware was everybody what that meant, or what you were experiencing together? Was this something that was being discussed or having conversations about, or is it more in hindsight that you realize it was all there right from the beginning?
That's a good question. I think it was somehow both. I think there was we knew that there was something extraordinary was happening in and between us of great significance. And even in those early days, there was a clear sense and recognition that this had significance way beyond our own personal liberation.
Yeah.
At the same time, looking back with all we know now that unfolded since, I think we were just, and on another level, we had no idea what the implications were and what the implications would be for us, in terms of, where that was going to take us and the depth of the ordeal and the surrender that was going to be required.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of pointing to. What I would like to go into now is, because what there is one thing in these conversations that I'm having that is surprising to me in all the conversations I have with the old time students, as you are, and with Mary and Steve. This realization that the intersubjective was there from the beginning. And then I wonder, or I also know that there was something happening in 2001, this big breakthrough, this big intersubjective breakthrough. So what I'm very curious about is, can you still kind of recall or explain what was it, what Andrew was pushing for there? Because obviously some people already experienced the intersubjective, the impersonal intersubjective before that. But then leading up to that famous day, 30th July 2001, he was pushing for something very specific. So I'm curious to hear it from you, how this all happened and what was different after.
Wow. Okay. So that's fast forwarding till quite a few years. So how best to speak of this? I think so. All of those years. So I was in Marin, California for a couple of years. Then I ended up going to London. I was actually in the London community for 3 and then I ended up going to Foxhollow in '97, I think, and I ended up staying there. I think all the men from London went on a trip. That's right, and then I ended up staying there. So it's a long period leading up to 2001, obviously. So there's a lot I could say, so much to explore. But just to stay with the thread of your the inquiry, as far as we were concerned, and I'll also, of course, speak for myself. What we were experiencing through those years, when we were at our best, and when it was really happening, particularly with the men, because as you know, we met primarily men together, and the women met as women. It was extraordinary, and so the intersubjective dimension of this profound communion and the depth and subtlety of inquiry that we would engage in. And of course, this is another of Andrew's greatest strengths, is he taught us how to inquire very deeply into the human experience. You know, it was profound and ecstatic, and there was a great process of purification and transformation that we were all involved in. And I think many of us, including myself, felt like we're doing it. You know, I mean, I was somebody who I loved the teachings. I worked in editorial, and you know, I'd be working with transcribed teachings and compiling them into different products and books and all that. So I was living and breathing Andrew's teachings, and you know, I think many of us felt like, you know, we were embodying and expressing this, what at that time was called the impersonal enlightenment potentials and perspective. But clearly Andrew always felt that there was way more to go.
Yeah.
So to zoom into that time, and I'm going to have to make some generalizations, but you know, I think we were doing relatively well, and I'm talking specifically more about the men here. It was a bit of a different story with the women. Well, extraordinarily well, I think, in terms of our own lived experience. But Andrew felt that, yeah, it was still relative, you know, and what he was shooting for was something that involved all of us, and you know, a complete kind of surrender, and taking full responsibility. You know, he would often talk about having an absolute relationship to life.
Yeah.
And you know, so I remember when before the run up to the July 30th time, of course, as I'm sure you know, was an incredibly intense ordeal. I mean, you know, I was in the car yesterday playing a song from a favorite band of mine, and it's called "If You Want to Go to Heaven, You've Got to Raise a Little Hell."
Oh.
And man, did Andrew raise some hell? I mean, I remember us. So one day, Andrew took us all out to a bar. You know, we just got the message we're going out with Andrew, and we went in a convoy of cars. You know, in the evening, and he took us to a bar, and we're all like, "What's going on?" You know, and we sat around this big table. He had us. We were all served with a beer. You know, some of us hadn't drank alcohol for years. You know, went straight to it, and he said, "Drink, drink." And what he basically said, he said, the revolution hasn't happened yet. And that was quite a moment, I remember, because if you had spoken to any of us, is the revolution happening? We'd be like, oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But is there further to go? Yeah, but it's happening. And he said, no, the revolution isn't happening yet, hasn't happened yet. And he then spoke a little bit, and he basically said, this is my sort of summary. He said, all of you are living relatively extraordinary spiritual lives, you know, compared to most other spiritual communities or, you know, endeavors. You are living extraordinary lives, but you're not living to the fullness of your potential, and you're not living, you're not fully living what you've been given and what you know and what you understood. And then he spoke to a few of us, one of them was me. And he said, well, there's Pete there, for example. You know, he knows the teachings better than most of you, you know, but would you know it from the way he lives his life? You know, and he was just pointing at the, you know, the level, the degree of my selfishness and then he went around to a few other people, and he basically said, right at the end, he said, so I'm going to have to force it to happen, because he was basically saying we weren't going to do it from our own will, you could say. And I'll never forget that moment. It was like he threw down the gauntlet on the table. And then we all drove back to Foxhollow, and I'll never forget being in the cars, and it was like you could have heard a pin drop, everyone was like, there was a big like, shh, oh my God, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And so then from then on, he proceeded to put tremendous pressure over a period of time to catalyze what he intuited was possible. And as we all know, that time is incredibly controversial. The way I see it is, Andrew was pushing for a breakthrough on a collective level. And he often said, even many times before that, he would say to us, I'm not interested in your individual awakening. I'm only interested in this potential burden. And even then, sometimes we would all gulp, be like, we felt the challenge of that, but none of us ran out of the room, or because we all knew there was something deeper and more profound than our own individual awakening. So that was already in us and in the mix. So I think for that reason, we hung in there for this challenge. But the way I see it is that maybe I can best illustrate it with my hands here. So what I'm illustrating here is the vertical dimension, right? The vertical dimension of that divine demand, and then the base of the triangle being the more horizontal dimension of inclusion.
Yeah.
And I basically feel that what happened during this time was like this. He was pushing for us to go way beyond all of our patterning and limitations and our resistance. And it wasn't enough if some of us were evidencing that. It was like, it had to be everyone.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, that was a very, very intense time. Some people left, never to come back. Some people left like I did, actually, and ended up coming back. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But I feel like what he did is he forged us into you could say, like a rocket ship.
Yeah.
And created the conditions for a breakthrough to occur. And granted, it's true, there was what we could call collateral damage. There were people who didn't make it, couldn't make it. There's a lot of controversy about a lot of the things he did at that time. But I was very close to him actually through some of that. He was also very creative. At times he was just relentless and in his pressure, but he was very wild and creative. He tried a lot of different things to make something to catalyze breakthroughs on collective levels. So one of the things he did with me is I became his cartoonist, because I draw cartoons, and he would have me draw cartoons of people, illustrating their egoic resistance or whatever was going on. And this all started quite gradually, and then it became all consuming. He'd pull me out of work and say, look, I need you to draw the cartoon of this and this whole this.
So he told you what to draw, or?
Yeah, well, he would tell me what he wanted it to convey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I would just do it.
Yeah.
And so also there was this humor, of course, wild humor at times, but also I saw Andrew's desperation, and this was also part of, I was doing this with the crisis that was occurring with the men at that time, but earlier on it had also occurred with the women.
Yeah.
And I saw a side of Andrew that I think a lot of people didn't see necessarily, or maybe people who weren't so close to him, that he was just trying things, and he was desperate. At times he was helpless, and he would say to me, he would say, look, I don't know what to do about it. This is what's happening. What do you think? And of course I'll be like, well, I don't know, Andrew, but he was just trying, everything he could to catalyze these deeper breakthroughs. And so I think some of it was very creative. I think some of it was just, he pushed too hard, or people couldn't meet, the demand he was making. But just to focus more on my own trajectory with it, at a certain point, I just felt overwhelmed by the intensity and the pressure. I, like all of us, came up against huge resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, I believe that Andrew, because of what he was pushing for, I feel that we were invoking, if you like, forces in the human condition that went way beyond ourselves individually.
Mm.
I know that myself, and I know I could see it happen with all my brothers.
Yeah.
It's like we became crippled by pride, fear, victimization. Um, I remember once, yeah, just because we had prostration practice, it's one of and I remember standing there once, and I just could not do it. There was just this
Mm.
refusal, and it just seemed like almost being taken over by some, you could say, devilish force.
Yeah.
So the way I understand it now is because Andrew was pushing for a breakthrough on this profoundly collective level, and he was pushing for something that had never happened before, I believe,
Yeah.
in human history, that it activated forces of, if you want to call it darkness or collective ego, that went way beyond our own sort of personal conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
This was a part of why it became such an intense and protracted battle and ordeal. Yeah, and in the midst of that, I just basically I broke at a certain point. Um, I remember vividly when it happened. He had one of the women, one of the rather attractive women. He had her dressed up as a kind of quite sexy waitress, and she came into my office and with a tray and a glass of whiskey on the tray, and said, "This is from Andrew. This is for you." You know, again, very creative. One of those things that could have gone either way, but for me at that time, I was like, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
It was just
Mm-hmm.
a way, like many ways, he was trying to uh, get us to break out of our resistance, our victimization.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually left, and I won't tell the whole story of that, but I was away for a few months, and then I went through quite a crisis and just had to face that I was running away, and uh, and basically ended up coming back
Mm-hmm.
to Andrew. Said, just expressed to him what I was facing. He just wrote me a very short message saying, "Dear Pete, come home. Love, Andrew."
Yeah.
And I came back, and I was picked up at the bus by one of the women, and she told me, she said, very good that you're back at this time. This is a very important time. You're going to be joining most of the men on retreat.
Oh, yeah. That was that time. Yeah.
So at that time, about 2/3 of the men Andrew had put on retreat just a few days before I arrived. And so I didn't speak to anyone. So imagine
Mm-hmm.
that. I've been out for about 4 months,
Mm-hmm.
and just came into this retreat with all of my brothers. And what I remember most vividly about it was the first day or two, I literally felt I was burning. It was like I've never experienced anything like it
Mm-hmm.
before or since. It was like there was this such intensity in the room. It was literally burning. And we were doing God knows how many hours of meditation, chanting, prostration practice. And that retreat ended up going on for 2 months.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was the most extraordinary cauldron, crucible of
Mm-hmm.
of practice and purification. And, you know, all of us had been through hell. And I think all of us were going through this process of just shedding everything that we've been through and confronting all of our resistance, our pride, our arrogance, our weakness, you know, and it was just burning up in this field of practice. And then towards the end of those 2 months, all we heard was that we were going to have a meeting with the group of men that weren't on retreat. And this was a smaller group. So what had happened is between that smaller group, they had began to catalyze something between them that up until that point was unprecedented. And they were really holding each other to an absolute context and standard.
Yeah.
So we began, those of us that were on the retreat, we began to meet with them. Mm-hmm. And it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary because those men, it wasn't that many of them, but they were clearly transformed. And obviously we were going through our own transformation. Yeah. So basically what happened in a few meetings is that there was probably maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of them, was that gradually we started to meet them and we started to come together in this profound freedom and recognition. But what was I think what was unprecedented about it was the subtlety to which we were able to see any expression of ego in each other, and that would be pointed out. Yeah. You know, whether it was some, you know, holding back, whether it was some degree of overconfidence or whatever expression it was taking, and it would just be pointing out, but it was just dissolved in that moment. Yeah. And gradually over time, more and more men were releasing themselves from whatever their fear and resistance was and just jumping into this fire. And so there were a few meetings that led up to July 30th. But what happened on July 30th was when the last man let go completely. Oh, yeah. And I knew we would want to talk about this, so I thought I'd like to read something from a book I wrote, because I actually wrote about it.
Yes.
So this is how I describe what happened. So as the last man who was still holding on to a vestige of doubt let go in an ecstatic expression of release, the circle exploded into a ring of spiritual fire, as we found ourselves consumed and transported beyond all knowing into the uncontainable mystery of a collective enlightened consciousness. All distinctions between the one and the many rapidly dissolved in a searing conflagration of unity. Every individual, mysteriously more fully themselves than ever before, melted into a glowing field of luminous energy. There was only one heart, one mind, and one voice that hungered to speak. But what was so new and utterly awe-inspiring was the unmistakable presence of a greater and higher intelligence that was emerging in the context of a seamless blend of autonomy and communion. This revelation was far more than a spiritual experience. It was the palpable sensation of becoming a conscious part of an even more infinitely conscious whole. It was as if we had somehow forged ourselves into a great unified receiver that was now able to pick up a signal that had always been there, but had hitherto been beyond our reach. A new matrix of awakened consciousness, literally a new being, unshackled from any vestige of separation, was surging into manifestation through us and as us. As each man abandoned himself without reservation and gave voice to this deepest heartfelt intuitive recognition of what was being revealed, the ring of fire vibrated with a luminous, insistent call that seemed to erupt from the depths of our souls and from the infinite vastness of the overarching cosmos simultaneously. Anyway, it goes on, but it was extraordinary. Yeah. And the image that comes to my mind when I remember it was like if you imagine a dam big dam that's holding back.
Yeah.
And then there's a hole in the dam, and it was just like, it
Yeah.
was so explosive.
Yeah.
And as I described it, as a ring of fire, it was literally once the last man let go completely, because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what it needed, you see. And
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
this is when we understood. It was only when every single man was completely given over that this
Yeah.
ring of
That
fire,
it
as I
could come
described it,
together.
opened.
Yeah.
And and so getting back to your early question, while there had been, again, relatively extraordinary immersions, in what we could call intersubjective awakening before that,
Mm-hmm.
this was of a completely different order.
Yeah.
And one characteristic of it was, as I described there, is we were all enlightened, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
were, there was no, that we would be looking at each other. We knew each other inside out, and it was like we were all utterly free.
Yeah.
There was this complete fullness of our individual expression, but at the same time, there was this tacit recognition that who we were, or what was emerging through us, was this new, with this new being. It was there was the sense of something profoundly, yeah, just of cosmic proportions, you could
Yeah.
say, that was being released. And yeah, it was absolutely extraordinary, and it was almost like you could see. I remember looking across the circle, and it was almost like you could see energy,
Yeah.
spiraling out of the crown of people's heads. There was a lot of energetic uh, release and phenomena. And
And there were many people in this group that had the same experience. I remember I saw a lot of letters that Andrew showed me
yeah,
that were written to him after that, and
yeah,
it was just one single witnessing of the same thing that was mind blowing.
that was amazing. And then
Yeah.
the amazing thing was the next. Let me tell you what happened at the end, because this is also very significant. So at the end of the meeting, the last man spoke, and what I felt, I remember it vividly. It was like then we all fell into this profound, ringing silence, and it was like this greater being, the
Mhm.
higher we, that, or as in Aurobindo called it, the supermind, whatever that phenomenon was. It was like it spiraled up and out of the room. That was my sense. It was just like, and then we were
Yeah.
just left, just in complete kind of shock and awe,
No.
and we could not speak.
Mhm.
And this is the amazing thing about what happened at the end. So nobody said anything from what I remember, but all of us got up and we spontaneously walked down to Andrew's house. And this was in the middle of the night, because the meeting went on for several hours.
Yeah.
The middle of the night must have been 1 or 2 in the morning, and we all prostrated in front of his house.
Mm. Wow.
It brings tears just to remember. And I remember lying there. I remember lying there on my nose in the gravel, and I was like, "Thank you, Andrew. Thank you." I went, and I was so grateful that I'd found the strength and the courage to come back.
Come back. Yeah. Sure.
This is the thing. I know there's a lot of controversy about all of this in this time, but I totally understand that a lot of people who left during that time, during that intensity, and they never made it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
They never experienced the victory.
The resolve for the victory. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
on the other side of that
Mhm.
tremendous ordeal.
Mhm.
And I remember it was like in that moment there was a tacit recognition of like, oh, this is why Andrew had to push so
Yeah.
hard. This is
Yeah.
what he was pushing for, and there was no way we could have known.
It's amazing how he foresaw this, no? How he had this
Yeah,
vision of what is possible.
yeah. And then the next day, I think it was the next night, we actually met with him,
Hmm.
and we were describing what had occurred, and it was very, very beautiful, because Andrew was so relieved, so utterly ecstatic, but
Yeah.
relieved and vulnerable. And I remember how he said to us, he said, guys, you have no idea what it's been like for me. I've been wondering if I'm crazy
Yeah.
all these years, and especially in the recent times. Was what I felt was intuitively possible, was it even real? You know, And I know that during that intensity of that ordeal, he didn't feel completely helpless. He was questioning himself. He was like, am I putting these people into a brick wall? Is this really possible?
Yeah.
So it was like a complete confirmation of that intuition that he had, years before, when in the early days when he recognized there was something happening between people that was more significant than what was happening between him and them individually. So that intuition and insight that occurred before I got involved defined his work and trajectory as a teacher, and so this was it was this cosmic confirmation that it was real and it was true. And I think for us, I mean, one thing many of us gave voice to is a tacit intuitive sense that this had never occurred before.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a very again controversial and radical thing to say, and I still feel that way about it. It's not a belief, but I feel that was a very profoundly significant spiritual event in human history. And and then there's everything that happened after that. We weren't able to sustain it, but something was born.
Yeah.
It's like there was a hole in the universe, if you like. There was something that came into being as a potential between us, and then it was.
Yeah.
Um,
But I totally agree with you. I also believe that something was broken through at that time that is available now.
mm,
And I had many experiences over the last years where I felt like we were able to access the same because of this breakthrough that happened then. It's almost like that it had to be carved once. I'm not saying it's simple or easy now. I'm not saying that at all. It's still it takes a lot from people who want to do it, but it's obvious that it's easier accessible as it was the first time.
yeah,
And I'm sure you had the same experience
yeah,
later with your community, no?
yeah, yeah. And I remember so there was a number of meetings probably carried on for maybe a couple of months after July 30th, just as it continued to be very volcanic and powerful. And then the intensity, I think there was something about the birth, you see. There was something about the energetic dimension of the birth that this had incredible power and intensity, and that gradually began to die down. And then different ones of us, were confronted with our own passioning and resistance. I mean, I ended up going through a whole other profound crisis after that, which actually became the most defining crisis I went through in my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And it was largely because I had to confront everything in me that didn't want anything to do with that, and because it just demanded everything.
Everything, yeah.
And so I went through another ordeal after that, and as many people did at different times. But yeah, and
But I also think from what Andrew shared and also what I discussed with Andrew, that the expectation, what was possible with this breakthrough, was probably in the end too high.
yeah,
Because it looked so promising. It felt like, and it does feel like, even if we experience it now, it feels like everything is possible, and nothing is in the way, and that this group of people surrendered to the new being can change the world, literally. And it turned out that it was not that simple, no, that it was much more difficult to actually keep it as a cultural standard. It kind of remained, and I would say, even for the groups that still are doing the intersubjective non-duality work in different places in the world, and we did it in the last 10 years with Andrew, it still stays or is a practice
that one can practice and you can experience higher states, but it's far from being cultivated as a cultural, how do you say that, artifact, or a cultural truth,
or maybe the language of integral, Ken Wilber, states and stages. And it's interesting because as I said in what I read, it was far more than a spiritual experience.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a higher state. I mean, of course it was that, and there was profound the energetic dimension to it. But it was as if in that meeting we all kind of stepped into a new stage. We felt and recognized, and what it was revealed to us, what that potential would be if all the dimensions of our being could be up leveled to that revelation that was drenching us. And I think that's why that meeting was so profound and significant, because it wasn't just a higher state that we left that then faded. There was knowledge. That's right. There was at that point unprecedented and groundbreaking knowledge and recognition, understanding that occurred. But my understanding of it now, and looking back and having learned, so much more over the years, is that going back to this image I was using to help illustrate this, Andrew's, as we know, Andrew's teaching and approach was very binary. It was very black and white. And this was both a tremendous strength of his teaching, and it also had its downsides and weaknesses. And it's so complex. There's no way to sort of resolve it all. But what I mean by that is I feel that that black and whiteness created a confrontation. And for these kind of breakthroughs, that confrontation created an evolutionary tension that was somehow necessary for those of us that could hold it to propel us, into orbit, so to speak, like the metaphor of a rocket taking off. How much it takes to actually
to actually get off the
all of that, So I feel that was, that was the strength in the, his approach was able to catalyze that. But at the same time, it didn't account for, and his teaching and approach wasn't really able to address what we could call the slower moving processes that cannot be
of the human psyche and the human.
They cannot be forced. They cannot be. They cannot. There's dimensions that are only can be transformed, let's say, through a process of grace, and surrender, but not a surrender that's as a result of relentless pressure. And so I feel like he created the conditions for us to make these incredible breakthroughs, but then inevitably over time when we go back to our lives, so to speak, and it would fall down. And I also think that part of that had to do with in the meetings, and this was pretty much always like this, and particularly leading up to July 30th, the purpose of the meetings was not to speak about any of the personal challenges we were going through to the best of our capacity, but to just be available for what wanted and could happen between us as a collective. But I think, and as you know, there was a lot of languaging of going beyond the personal, and this emphasis on the impersonal dimensions. But I think what got lost in that was a lot of things that we were all dealing with, our relationship to money or sexuality or different aspects of what we were struggling with in our own lives. After a certain point, I think Andrew expected that you should just be able to live the five tenets, take yourself on, so to speak, and then be available for these higher collective potentials. But I think obviously it wasn't that simple. So
No, it wasn't.
so
And I
think
do think that this is one of the things that Andrew had a totally different view on in the last 10 years of his teaching, and that he was much, much, much less binary in how he taught. But that also meant that there was much less breakthrough energy or radical spirit energy that was evoked.
yeah.
And I'm very aware of that. And I think people still benefited a lot from his teaching, but what you are describing was less, because he was very aware that what happened with all the pressure, that it wasn't stabilized. But then, and he did it very differently in the last 10 years. But it would still have to be proven that that new approach would actually lead to sustained intersubjective communion between people. I would almost say we probably had similar problems, not coming from the pressure, but from the non-pressure, that people couldn't really hold it, like the high stand that Andrew was still pointing to.
Yeah.
And for me, this is one of the big questions, because I'm totally in contact with his vision, but I have no idea how it can be actualized actually between people. And what I agree with you, it takes much more time than probably, it probably takes generations or lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, I was reflecting on it today, you know, that Andrew was very impatient,
Yeah.
and but in a, also in a good way, and part of that, even from the beginning, as I was saying, that sense of that we were on fire, there was something burning,
Yeah.
and it's just extraordinary. I think Andrew just had this intuition of some possibility, even though I mean, and that's a mystery in and of itself, how and why he had that. It's also interesting that, he wasn't with us. He wasn't actually a part of it with us in quite, um, and yet he had this intuition of what was possible through, these higher state stage collective group dynamics. So so he, and obviously he, as time went on, I mean, as a teacher, I think, and I think this evolved over the years, that this was the only aspect that had any meaning for him, and as I said earlier, he often used to say, look, in the 90s leading up to this time, I'm not interested in your individual evolution and awakening. And what one can say, well, that was something that was lacking, looking back now, was enough room to grow individually, and that maybe certain people needed certain challenges or
Yeah, and the stable, I think today a stable awakening is the starting point, to be able to come together with other stably awakened people, whatever stable awakening means. We could discuss that, but we have a sense what a stable awakening could look like, and then you can come together with people. And if it's just a state that is induced because kind of the conditions are right, it's not gonna stick.
No. So I think that's both the weakness and the strength of Andrew's approach. I don't think it. This is my belief based on all my experience. I don't think it would have occurred unless Andrew had been willing to take enormous risks and push us as intensely as he did. That's not to say, there's justification for everything that occurred.
Yeah.
Negative side. But it's just, as he often used to say, evolution is a messy business. And if you're committed to making profound breakthroughs, it's one thing to be committed to that process individually, but to do that together, it's going to be a messy process, and there's going to be all kinds of forces that are activated, and and then I know what a big challenge it is, and what Andrew faced. How do you take a collective, guide a collective in a transformational process, where you're being as inclusive as possible. You want to take as many along for the ride as who are up, but at the same time, if you become too inclusive, then you lose that verticality. The rocket ship's not going to take off. So some people aren't going to make it. Some people, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them, or they don't have an authentic spiritual process, but for whatever reason, they weren't able to get on the ship.
For this specific process, you need everybody fully in and fully be able to do it. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. I mean, I've seen groups where one single person is preventing everybody else from moving forward. That's just how the spiritual physics works here.
Yeah. And then in terms of that question of if we want to call it a higher stage versus a higher state, when that awakening would become stabilized, as you put it, there's so many dimensions to that, and of course all the karmas of every individual, and so much complexity, and it's inevitably going to be messy. Its mistakes are inevitably going to be made, and my sense is in terms of what we all sort of glimpse, doesn't feel like the right word, because it was far more than that. That revelation that we found ourselves immersed in, we being overtaken by that potential, that one awakened self that was looking through all our eyes, to actually live there, be there. I mean, that's such an immense process of purification and transformation that would need to address all dimensions of life. And who knows, maybe it was in terms of its fullness, maybe it's a potential that's still quite far ahead of us. I don't know,
but it's there, and that's good to know. Pete, I would like to cover one other topic with you, because we are quite far into our conversation already, and I don't want to go too long, but I would like to cover one thing, because that's very special in your biography with Andrew, and that's the point where you later, I think in 2004, actually left the community and started to do your own thing. But you were not expelled by Andrew. Why I bring this up is because I find it very interesting that this was an option for you. And if you can talk a little bit about this whole process, how it came about, and how the interaction with Andrew then was when you kind of took the teaching forward and did your own thing, independent of Andrew, not as part of Enlighten Next. Which I think is very it's a special case in a way,
it is interesting, and it was actually 2005. So I'd gotten to a point. So you have 2001 when this breakthrough occurred collectively, and then, as I said, I went through another crisis about a year after that, and again, quite an ordeal. Came through the other side, and when I came back through the other side, I was changed. Something in me had shifted profoundly. So, to put it simply, what I was always up against was I had the recognition. I was one of the people that taught the talk and even transmit the teachings to a degree. I had, Andrew always said I had enormous potential. But there was this selfishness in me, and basically, let's just say that, an unwillingness to fully and completely surrender, and basically that happened. And so that would have been in 2013, 2003. So for the last 2 years, I was a part of Enlighten Next. I felt like I was completely available, and yeah, I wasn't the there wasn't this intense
holding back,
holding back anymore, and basically I felt like, in a sense, that wasn't being fully recognized perhaps by Andrew. I mean, Andrew had been through such with me, but also I felt in terms of, I was always frustrated creatively. I wanted to be part of working on the magazine, for example, and there were practical issues why also that wasn't possible. I was an illegal alien living there in Foxhollow, and basically I just got to a point where I just felt like it was partly to do with that and the rigidity of the structure. I just felt like it's not happening here. And it all came to a head when Andrew put me on a project to do with creating a new website, which I didn't really feel was my forte. It wasn't really what I was good at. I was more good at editorial and the words, but I gave myself to it completely. But I was put in a completely unreasonable situation of, I was still at that point working to support myself, and there was just not enough resources. And basically, long story short, it ended up not. I ended up failing. Let's say, at a certain point, he took me off that project. I couldn't make it happen, and it was like this sensation, and that often happened around Andrew. And I think this is a good metaphor for it is, the game Snakes and Ladders. Do you know this game, Snakes and Ladders? And
yeah.
a bit like that being with Andrew. You get to a ladder, so you'd be in a meeting and something will come out, go up the ladder, and then you would be so-called promoted to, now you can have a greater responsibility in some department, and you're doing great, kind of thing. And it was my sensation after all these years, and knowing that I was in a heart-surrendered place, and there I was doing really well in the board game, and then I hit a snake right at the end, and it took me all the way back down. And you're kind of in this position of sort of being in the doghouse again. But it wasn't to do with me being in an egoically resistive place. It was just like I hadn't come through with the project. So basically, all of this conspired to bring me to a point where I just felt like it wasn't happening. But it wasn't as gracious as in the sense of Andrew giving me permission at that point. I basically decided I just had to leave. The last dialogue I had with Andrew was very significant. He basically said to me, "You know everything. You've been to heaven and hell, agony and ecstasy. I just need to know if you're going to be of use to me." Basically, what he was saying to me at that point is, you're with me and you're going to give your life to what I'm doing, or not. And I always look back and wish I'd had the courage to say, come back to him and say, well, Andrew, I don't think I am going to be of use to you. So that maybe he might have actually blessed my exit. But at that point, there was still a lot of fear in me of like the reprisals and what might happen if I actually said I wanted to leave. So I just left. And but I stayed in touch with Andrew, and I always expressed my gratitude to him. And about 2 years later, so I ended up getting together with Cynthia, who was also part of the Enlighten Next community, although she was never a formal student. And we got together, and out of our time together, this vision began to emerge. We didn't know what we wanted to create, but it was basically a vision to buy some land, and start some kind of a project dedicated to what the mission statement ended up being, was living the truth of unity in harmony with the ecological web of life. So we bought an abandoned farm here in Portugal and put up a blog with that mission statement, and people started to come, and that's how it all started. I had no idea about being a spiritual teacher or anything like that. Basically, what happened after a few years, we just had meditation as a part of our context and practice, and people requested me to, they wanted to know more about the spiritual context and vision. And gradually I was invited to teach. And at a certain point, I started to offer meditation retreats. So when this started to happen, it was obviously broadly what I was sharing was what my own expression of what I'd learned over all those years with Andrew. So it was very important for me to have his blessing. I said to him, look, Andrew, this is starting to happen. I'm getting requests. I even sent him recordings of what I was doing. And he was very, very positive. Now, if he had said to me, no, this is completely off, there's not, you're not in integrity, I wouldn't have done it. But I think I knew in myself that there was something pure that was happening. So it meant an tremendous amount to me that he supported me in that. And then we kept in touch. And I think it was a time then, it was also because Craig Hamilton shortly left after I left, and he started his whole thing online. And I think it was a time when Andrew was realizing that for some of us, the context of what Enlighten Next didn't allow us to fully flower. Give whatever gifts we had to give. So I think I was one of the first, because I still sustained a relationship with him where he was able to actually support me, and that was a very very beautiful thing. We would occasionally stay in contact, and it came more full circle around. So I left 2005. So around 2010, 11, 12, me and some of my Cynthia and I and we bought some of our students at the time Tuscany retreat. And there were 2 Tuscany retreats that I went to, and that was like a really full-on reconnection with Andrew and the community, those people that were there at the time. And I was even he even had me lead discussion groups. Leading groups along. And that was just amazing that he he met me where I was and invited me in. And so for those last few years before the community crashed and dissolved, I was in a hold-on with some of the committed student guys. I was kind of part of Enlighten Next, but Andrew, I remember we were in Tuscany, he invited me and I made very clear to him, I said, Andrew, look, I'm completely committed. I'm all in with what I'm doing. I can't give any of my time and energy to Enlighten Next. And he said, no problem. I just want to offer you the opportunity to be reconnected as a means of supporting what you're doing.
Cool.
And that was beautiful.
Very beautiful. I was just thinking, as you tell all these stories, can you say a few words about what you think today about, in general, the student-teacher relationship or guru-disciple relationship? Is that still something that is important moving forward for humanity, for people that want to grow spiritually? What is your view today of a teacher-student relationship?
My view is that it's absolutely important. And I say, except in very, very rare cases, maybe someone like Ramana Maharshi, but he said Arunachala was his guru. I think it's indispensable. There is just no way. I can speak for myself. As I said, if I look back, ever since my teenage years, I've known that I was never going to live an ordinary life, and so there was a spiritual longing, and I would be overcome in sort of spontaneous meditation when I was a teenager. I didn't know what it was at the time, so I was totally committed. But there's no way I would have come anywhere near the understanding, recognition, revelation, and the ordeal of purification that I underwent, and not just with Andrew, since. without a willingness to recognize and then respond, and therefore surrender to someone who it was clear could show me the way forward. So again, it's a very controversial subject, but I feel one of the greatest gifts actually Andrew's book, when shadow meets the bodhisattva. One of the things I appreciated so much about that book, not only his own raw vulnerability in sharing his own process and everything he had to face after the collapse of Enlightenment, but how he opened up just this wider inquiry into the perils and pitfalls and complexity of the guru-disciple, teacher-student relationship in the postmodern West. And I think it was an invaluable contribution to that whole exploration. And but my own feeling is that, of course, times have changed now, and we're living in an even more intensely postmodern, potentially, I think, pathologically postmodern culture that is they're totally anathema to the idea of a spiritual guru and hierarchy and the depth of surrender that's required. I mean, of course, the big question, I think, in a postmodern context, because as we know, we're not coming from a traditional context where that depth of surrender comes more easily. Exactly. Here we are, highly developed, Western postmodern Westerners. How do you surrender to the degree that you can be taken beyond yourself, with and by through the guru principle, and at the same time not this word that's often being used these days, not to deny or lose one's authentic sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly.
But you see, there's no that's a conundrum. There is no solution to that riddle. And I still lean on the side of, like, if one's serious about spiritual awakening, you have to be willing to take the biggest risk that there is, which is to give yourself over, and that, of course, can only occur if there's a spontaneous response to take one in that direction. It cannot be forced. But if that possibility would present itself, and of course, traditionally, that's always been understood, that it's the guru principle that, in almost all cases, is the bridge, if you like, to us realizing our highest potential. So
absolutely. As you say, it's the guru principle. And I think one thing that could change, and still the guru principle could be honored, is that what Andrew also wrote in his book, that the guru cannot be this perfected human being that knows everything and can tell you everything and is always right. I think that is not possible in a postmodern world anymore. Just not. Because it's also not realistic, and it never was. In a way, no guru ever was all-knowing and omniscient. But that means that it takes much more from the guru or the teacher and from the student and the disciple to make these subtle distinctions, because a full surrender is a full surrender. It's, in a way, that's easy. If you can fully surrender to a guru and think he knows everything and I just do what you tell me to do, that's in a way simple. But when you start to make distinctions, where is the guru principle talking to you, and where it's the man or the not totally refined human expression of that guru principle, then it gets really tricky and really difficult, challenging for both, for the guru and for the student.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you're bringing up. I think for me, going back to what I shared at the beginning about how I met Andrew, because that meeting was beyond the personal. And so I think for me, I know this whole subject of the perceived perfection of the mythic guru archetype, as Andrew wrote about it in his book. it was never quite like that for me. I never sort of regarded Andrew as perfect or needed to see him as being perfect. Um, and again, I know there's sort of, there was, there were definitely ways that I don't know if he would ever explicitly have said that, but I remember there was a teaching that he gave to cast no shadow, for example. So there was a sort of unspoken presumption that Andrew had no shadow, which of course became problematic. But I just know in my case, and for me, the principle, it's the purity of motive,
Yeah.
and you know, like I'm one of there's things that happen to me. I've been written about in negative accounts that students have written as being abused by Andrew. There's things that happen to me that so many people regard as being profoundly abusive, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't experience it that way.
Yeah.
It's not to say that if I hadn't come through, and I probably would have
You
been a
would see it differently, exactly.
And it's not to say that Andrew was sometimes merciless, and we could even say cruel, But for me anyway, when I made a breakthrough, he was always right there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was freedom has no history.
Yeah.
And so when I reflect back, I'm like, well, 90% of the time when Andrew was putting me under immense pressure, he was right on the money. He cared about my liberation more than I did when it really mattered. And maybe there's another 10% of the time where he was either too strong or, a more nurturing, loving, mother force, which Andrew tended to lack, would have gone a lot further than just more like, and I think that's true. He lacked he was a Shiva, he had a very strong father force, and he lacked a more, you could say, I hate to use the word feminine, but maybe mother force, that sense of nurturing and that sense of knowing you are loved, even in this, even when he's like, beating you over the head, so to speak. So there's all of those dimensions, but
this, by the way, came out beautiful in the last 10 years. That's a transformation he went through over the last 10 years. That he changed in that way, and also the teaching changed in that way, that it, as we said before, that it was much less black and white, but gained profound depth, because the non-duality of his teaching actually felt really non-dual, because it didn't have these edges of go baby go and being and becoming as two different things. It became much more integrated, like his power to integrate and to have compassion and to transmit love has increased a lot. And was beautiful to see.
Yeah, I acknowledge that, and I felt that when I was with him recently.
Yeah.
And but just to finish what I was saying about the guru principle, so is that, to me, it can never be about the perfection of the human being.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist, and especially if a guru is in a situation of really taking on people and challenging people, there's no avoiding the complexity, and the mistakes are going to be made. But it's always like, what is the motive? What is the intention? And there may have been times when, even in Andrew's case, that intention was off. But in terms of my experience, he cared very, very passionately about the potential that he saw both in us individually and especially as a collective. And he was just willing to take enormous risks. And in some ways, he lacked sensitivity, he lacked capacity. There's all kinds of dimensions, and he had to go through more of a process of becoming a more rounded, human being in the way you described. But I'll always, be grateful for the fact that he didn't hold back, and he gave what he had to give, and he learned a lot. We all learned a lot. And you know, one of the big lessons I feel is just the challenge to be able to hold complexity.
Yeah.
And bear the enormous complexity of the human condition when it's confronted with the possibility of awakening.
Yeah. I feel that's a good place to end, Pete. What do you think? I know we could talk for hours.
Go on for hours, yeah. I'd be happy to end with that.
It feels like that's such a beautiful point probably to end for now. And I really appreciate the conversation with you. It brought a lot of new and deeper aspects, as all the conversations are kind of a puzzle that shed a lot of light of what actually was happening in all its complexity. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been quite a journey also to relive some of this.
Yeah.